Now that we've learned all about cell division and its role in reproduction, let's learn about heredity. In Chapter 4.1, the key concept is that living things inherit traits in patterns. Let's start with The Simpsons. What physical similarities do you notice in this Simpson family? Maybe you noticed that they all have the same skin color. They have the same nose shape. Marge and Lisa have the same shaped mouth. Homer and Bart also have the same shaped mouth, and they're different from Marge and Lisa's. They have the same eyes. And Lisa and Maggie have the same hair. Some traits are inherited. These characteristics are things that are similar to your parents, such as hair color, eye color, the number of legs that you have, or if you have dimples. Some traits, however, are what we call acquired traits. These are things that you learn over your lifetime. Things like reading, writing, riding a bike, or the language that you speak. So what are some of your traits? Do you have a cleft chin? Do you have dimples? How about a hitchhiker's thumb? Or a widow's peak? This is when your hairline kind of dips down in the center, makes a V. Do you have attached or detached earlobes? It has to do with where the earlobe attaches to the side of your head. This is an attached earlobe, and if it kind of scoops up first before it goes back, or before the skin attaches, that's a detached earlobe. Do you have curly hair? Can you roll your tongue? Are you right-handed? Or are you colorblind? The traits that we just mentioned are all controlled by genes. Most of them are controlled by more than one gene that would be found in the DNA of your body. However, some traits are controlled by only one gene. Offspring inherit genes from their parents. Let's take a look at how this happens.
Your genes come from your parents, of course, and from their parents, and from their parents' parents, and, well, you get the idea. You have two sets of 23 chromosomes, one set from each parent. For almost every chromosome you inherit from your mother, you also inherit one from your father that has his versions of the same genes. Together, they form a pair of homologous chromosomes. The X and Y chromosomes, however, are special. Usually, females have two X chromosomes, while males have an X and a Y. You get one of your X chromosomes from your mother. Whether you get your father's X chromosome or his Y chromosome determines your sex. Most adult cells contain two sets of chromosomes, but sperm and egg cells have only one set of 23 chromosomes each. When the body forms sperm or egg cells, a cell divides and pairs of chromosomes separate. A random member of each pair moves into each new cell. This is why, when you were conceived, you obtained half of your mother's genes and half of your father's genes. But your siblings didn't necessarily get the same versions of your parents' genes that you did. Unless you happen to be an identical twin. To form sperm or egg cells, your your chromosomes double, like so. When the homologous pairs separate, sometimes they cross over and, at seemingly random points, exchange DNA. This is called genetic recombination. Because your genes get shuffled during recombination, the chromosomes you pass along to your children are not exactly the same as the ones you inherited from your parents. This makes it hard to use most of your chromosomes to trace your genealogy back very far. However, most of the Y chromosome is handed down from father to son, entirely intact. Likewise, in humans, DNA in the mitochondria is passed on only from mother to child. For this reason, ancestry along your father's line or your mother's line is easier to trace using the Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA. When sperm and egg cells join together at fertilization, they create a single cell with two complete sets of 23 chromosomes, one set from your mother and one from your father. This single cell will divide to create new cells over and over until it creates a child.
So there you saw how we went from one set of DNA to an entire human being. Genes are small sections of DNA on a chromosome. You saw in the video that they're represented by location. So the location of the gene or the several genes that are responsible for your eye color are always in the same place and on the same numbered gene. Your cells contain 23 matching pairs of chromosomes. The name for this is a homologous pair. One chromosome for each pair came from mom, while the other came from dad. So if we look at this picture of the chromosomes in a normal human being, you have one from mom, one from dad. One from mom, one from dad. One from mom, one from dad. For each of the 23 chromosomes that you have. Genes are on chromosome pairs. Each homolog, meaning each chromosome in a pair, contains the same genes at the same location. The genes are present on both homologs, but the form of the gene might be different. Let's take a look at this pair of chromosomes for a plant. Different forms of the same gene are called alleles. So, for this plant, the plant inherited one chromosome from the female plant and one chromosome from the male plant. And you can see this band here represents the gene for the flower color. Now, both parent plants gave the offspring plant a gene for the color of its flowers, but one parent gave it a purple flower gene, while the other one gave it a white flower gene. Those different forms, the purple versus the white, are called the alleles for that gene. Let's talk now about how we found all of this out. Let's look at the early years of experiments in heredity. The father of genetics is a person called Gregor Mendel. He performed the first major experiments that investigated the heredity from parents to offspring. He was an Austrian monk. He went to a university, which was not that common at the time, for math and science. He did his experiments between 1856 and 1863. And this is a picture of his pea plant garden in the Czech Republic, which still exists today. Now, he did his investigations, he did his experiments using pea plants for a number of reasons. They're really easy to grow, they grow quickly, and they have a lot of traits that are controlled by only one gene. A lot of the traits that you and I have are controlled by more than one gene, like hair color and eye color and skin color, and a whole bunch of other traits. So that makes the process in humans very complicated to study. But pea plants are different. most of their traits are controlled by simply one gene. So let's take a look at what he did. So this says, hello, I'm Gregor Mendel. I worked with pea plants because they're easy to grow. They have many traits that distinguish strains of pea plants from each other, and the traits could be tracked from one generation to the next. When left alone, pea flowers self-fertilize. That means the male cell and the female cell are in the same flower. The stamens are the male sex parts. They mature first and drop the pollen inside the immature flower. The pistil is the female sex part, which matures later. Its eggs are fertilized by the pollen that lands on the pistil. To cross-fertilize pea plants, he opened the immature flower, took off the petals. Then he cut off the stamens before they could mature. After the flower matured, after the female part was ready, he dusted its pistil with pollen from a different plant. This is called cross-fertilization. He actually took a brush and took the pollen from one plant and put it into the flower of the other plant. So that's what Gregor Mendel did in order to control which plants were receiving which traits. Mendel noticed that some plants always produced offspring that were exactly like the parent plant. He called these plants purebred plants. For example, one of the traits that he worked with was the height of the plant. Some plants grew to be very short, called dwarf plants, and some plants grew to be taller. He called these tall. He noticed that purebred short parents always produced short offspring. They didn't have any tall plants that grew from the seeds of those plants. He also noticed that purebred tall parents always produced tall offspring. So he wondered, what would happen if I took a tall parent and crossed it with a short parent? Mendel crossed purebred plants with opposite forms of the trait. He called these the parent generation, or the pea generation. So he took one tall parent and one short parent, and then he looked at the offspring that grew from those seeds. All of the offspring that grew were tall. This was called the F1 generation. So we have the parent generation and the first filial generation. None of the offspring plants resembled the short parent plant. So then he wondered, okay, what if I took two of these plants and crossed them? What would happen then? So that's exactly what he did. He took two of the offspring tall plants produced from his first experiment, and he used the cross fertilization technique. And what he found were that the offspring produced 3/4 or 75% were tall, and 1/4 or 25% of the offspring plants that grew were back to the short. He called this generation the second generation, or the second filial generation. He observed that this generation had a mix of tall and short plants. And he did this over and over again, and he found that the ratio, the 75% to 25%, was always the same. So from that, he realized that alleles must interact in order to produce traits. The short parent and the tall parent, something must be going on in order to produce all tall offspring. And then if you took offspring that had one short and one tall parent, something must go on to produce the 75%, 25% mix. So from that, he coined the terms genotype. This is the name for the genes an organism has. To make it easy, we use capital letters and lowercase letters to represent the genotype. Your genotype is not always obvious based on your appearance. Remember that you have two forms of each gene, one allele from your mom and one allele from your dad for each gene. And your genotype produces or gives you your phenotype. Your phenotype is the description of what we can actually see about you. So in this case, this is showing you green pea pods and green pea pods. The other option, I think, is a yellow pea pod. And so if you said that the peas were green, that's describing its phenotype. Or here you have the genotype, which represents the actual chromosomes or the genes on the chromosomes, and it codes for what the organism actually looks like. Things like color, size, things like that. So let's look a little more about what phenotype is.
Your observable traits, also known as your phenotypes, result from the interaction between your genes and the environment. This interaction begins in the womb and continues throughout your life. Differences in some phenotypes, like height, are determined mostly by genes. If you have short parents and grandparents, you probably don't tower over your peers, though environmental factors like nutrition can have some effect on your height. Genes also play a role in whether you have a healthy body weight. But diet and exercise can profoundly affect how